Eventually he discovered that some upon this prime could sense his probing of their realm, and some took an inquisitive look to his threads. He soon found himself staring back at the representatives of this prime, and communication began with them. They wished to know what he was, for they could sense he held daemonic energies, but also sensed that he had what they referred to as the touch of the divine about him. They reasoned that perhaps he was a fallen god that had been trapped in the wars of another prime, whilst combating the demonic forces of the source, and that he needed their aid to escape his prison. He could not believe his fortune. To find creatures so easily swayed, so willing to help him escape this prison of his own creation. So he accepted and worked with them, and within the space of a century or so, they erected a huge temple with which to draw energies from the demonic plane he was trapped in, and allow them to attune a portion of their own prime to it, thereby allowing him to step through and take his rightful place back upon a prime, where he could then contact the Divine Ones and return to them once more. Of course, he was not going to tell them that was what he wanted, but not for the reasons they held. They were unwittingly sending him home to the host, back to chrylsis, and this pleased him. Before he entered their prime, however, he allowed his magics to permeate their realm, so he could detect others touching their prime, only to discover that they had a few temples to gods that no longer seemed to be present upon their realm. Upon completion of the gateway, he stepped through, and they looked on in awe at his sheer power, his divine form. To them, he was truly a lost god. They asked questions of his origins, where he had hailed from, who he was, and it was then he realized he did not know. He knew of his origins, of course, and how he came to be, but the simple question threw him into a stunned silence. He did not have a name, an identity to others. The large-scaled creature explained to him over many days that he must have had a name. How else could he have gleaned his power from the connection between his followers and his places of worship, and ultimately communication from above with the others of divine form? He slowly understood that those upon the primes, those who were not as he, immortal, had short lives, and seemed to, for some reason, tie their existence to various hosts. So this was where they got their power from the very life upon the primes themselves. He had yet another goal, a way to weaken his foes, to take something from them. But yet he wondered, could he be worshipped as they, and in turn gain what they themselves had? Could he gain power from a following, from the fealty of lesser creatures? What did they call it? Ah yes, a priesthood. The Scaled One introduced him to others of their kind, also scaled, and immense in stature, and they announced they had all paid fealty at one time to a divine host, but the divinity of the realm vanished as the sky shook and the stars went out, leaving them with very few lights in their skies at this time. Some cataclysm had taken place, and the two divine hosts that they had sworn their faith to had gone, but they kept their spirits high, and their powers honed, such as they were now without the touch of the divine gifts, but they were mere shadows of their former glory. They took him to one of their grand old temples, and this is where he saw a familiar sight. A host he knew all too well, for it was among the ones he had taken within him in his attack upon them. He now knew the devastation his actions had caused, and for a moment he realized the impact of his actions, as fast and as simple as they were, upon the primes that had relied upon those hosts for guidance, for power, and in some cases, he wagered, for their very existence. They tried to divine his name, as he was clearly in need of this knowledge, but they could not find one, as the divination showed his own divinity was unique, untouched by the ceremonies and initiations they had learnt about in their time upon the prime, and came to reason that he had for some reason been cast out from the divine before this could be done. before he became a true member of their kind, and they asked if he had any memory of this. He merely answered that he knew not who he was, nor why he was. He kept them at bay while his magic seeped into the realm slowly, but he discovered that demonic energies from the portal acted so very slowly here, as this prime somehow seemed to push back, almost resisting being permeated. It would be a long time if he let things take their natural course, but he could wait, for now at least. He spent many years with them, learning in the conventional manner, talking, interacting, and realizing that these creatures knew far more than he could ever glean merely by taking their bodies. He had to gain this information firsthand, and with this simple realization, he now knew how he must move forward. He asked if it was possible for this initiation ceremony to be completed, so he could take his place with the host, or as they put it, the divine. They said they knew of ways and hidden places around existence, but that although they themselves were extremely well versed with many differing magics and divine secrets, they could not themselves perform such a task. However, some of their kinds had left to traverse the plains, and they knew some who might hold such knowledge, and so they reached out and contacted their kin upon these places and other primes. He took advantage of these links they established to put forth the seeds of his own magic, planting a thread or two upon each of these places so he could sense their locations in future times, so as not to alert the denizens directly of his presence. This went on for many years, until finally replies had been given from most of the scattered brethren, and it seemed that they must contact the Old Ones, known to their kind as the First. Discussions were had about these creatures, these First, and all he could gather was that these Scaled Ones knew of their existence, but had never directly contacted them before. These creatures were said to be entities of great power and intellect, who had harnessed the very power of the demonic planes, as well as the nature of the divine itself. Yet they were themselves, although according to myth, immortal. They were in fact born of the true prime, the first prime, the original place where life had willed itself into being from the cacophony of power from all the planes that had touched it. This place had no known location, and it was said it was the central nexus of all primes, with all primes being in some small part created from a portion of this one true prime. It was also said that this prime was in contact with every plane of existence, and yet from what he had seen, he knew nothing of such a place. For when he looked across existence from the host's place of seeing, he had seen no indication of such, but he did not tell them this. He was then told by one of the younger Scaled Ones that it was theorized that this place had been taken by the demonic source at some point in the past, and since then had vanished from the touch of all. Another Scaled One offered forth the theory that this place had severed its contacts with all other primes in order to protect its sanctity in future times, to keep it pure and untouched, eternally without taint or subversion. And other ideas were mulled over and passed forth, but all made his head spin and left him somewhat confused, but at least he now had possibilities. There could potentially be a prime where all of the planes touched, and where even their demonic source itself could potentially be traversed to. This idea intrigued him, and he swore to them he would test this out if he ever got the chance to find such a place. It was safe to say he had started to grow content with these talks, with the presence of others around him, of an uneasy peace within him. These lesser creatures believed he was an unknown, and truly had no memory, and he would let them think this as long as it served his purposes, all the while his threads reaching out from their realm, prying further into the planes that touched their own. Time passed by quietly, until one of the threads he seeded upon a plane where the Scaled Ones had contacted had vanished from a realm he had placed it within. He reached out slowly to that place and let his power flow back there, only to find something waiting on the other side. Something familiar, yet foreign to him. Something that felt, well, like him. He quickly explained to the Scaled Ones that he could sense something upon the place where they had contacted, and they were puzzled by his admission of such powers. They opened a small rift to this prime, allowing them to peer through, to question their envoy within this realm. But they were confronted with a terrible sight of carnage, devastation, utter annihilation of the realm that lay before them. He peered through their rift and could sense immediately himself again, and asked that they open the rift so he could enter and discover what had happened there. They reasoned it was a bad idea, but his demands were eventually met, with the rift being enlarged so he could step through. And as he did, he felt the magic wash over him. A daemon was here, and it was truly a powerful one, beyond anything he had felt before, and it was feeding. He examined the threads of the prime he now stood upon, and he could see the daemon's imprint slowly corrupting this realm, absorbing the magic that flowed across the land and replacing it with his own demonic energies. It was his, but yet was somehow not. He drew a portion of it to him and pulled it apart, stripping it thread by thread, unwinding it, unravelling the intricacies, and identifying each portion of it, examining the powers this daemon had, and could find nothing. No ability to fling forth demonic energies, or manipulate the realm upon which he stood. No ability to command his legions, like him. No legions of minions, in fact. This was a single entity. No way to take it by subversion, and no way to surreptitiously pull the demonic plane out from under his control, as the corruption of the land was happening, and the power absorbed was flowing toward one spot. The place where the fires and clouds of thick smoke and dust could be seen, with intense lightning writhing all around, accompanied by the deafening sounds of rending stone. It could have been mistaken for a volcano erupting, but he knew better. From behind him the Scaled Ones watched from the relative safety of their prime. They asked if he needed their aid, but he declined, and told them he would contact them when the fight was over, as he did not wish to lose his newfound friends. They understood, and wished him in all his divinity a successful exploration, and then sealed the rift, leaving a tether for him to request a recall when he was ready to return. He followed the flow of magic, pulling at threads and taking them into himself as he moved. It was indeed of his own kind. No, it was actually of himself. This meant that this daemon, whatever it was not only like him, it essentially was him. Could it be that it found his source, or perhaps even a lesser of him that he had no knowledge of? He would find answers from this daemon, and he would no longer be alone in his existence. Finally, an entity his equal to share his power and knowledge with. As he approached, he saw a sight he had no former experience of. A colossal manifestation of power that was beyond reasoning. Limbs of such size and strength. He had never realized his kind could be so large. All of the confrontations he had been a part of had ended with him fighting entities several times his size. This was true. But this daemon, this power, was like nothing he had witnessed before. The head, if that was what it was nestled beneath so many protrusions of spines and spikes that it was hard to make out, and the neck of this form was long and thick. It was so immense it was beyond his scale to reason. Even the Scaled Ones were nothing more than the size of his hand in comparison, and they were by all his travels considered to be very large. But this thing had hands, well, clawed implements, that were covered in thorny spikes that could be considered hands, that could crush a Scaled One with ease. All around it magic was flowing, circling in a maelstrom, twisting and tearing apart as it fed upon the shredded reality of this prime, feeding hungrily as once he had upon the hosts. And he felt the voices for the first time in many years, pushing forth, urging him to feed with his brethren. This creature was easily the size of the huge stone formations that creatures built their cities in the shadows of. usually topped with the white, soft ice that fell at times from the skies on some primes. He had seen this upon the prime he had just left, and was still in awe at the sheer size of this daemon, and as soon as he got to the edge of the maelstrom, it acknowledged his presence with a simple gaze and nod. He stood and watched as it fed, unsure whether to feed or not, but the voices within demanded, and as he wrestled with them, the daemon turned to him, and its voice roared across the landscape. "Feed, lost one! Feed!" He opened up his host, and allowed his essence to draw some of the maelstrom in, and was lost in the ecstasy of what he felt. The raw power of a prime, ripped apart, shredded to its purest form, and drawn into him. A sustenance that was, in comparison, to the taste of the host themselves, only there was so much more of it here, and he began to feed hungrily. The daemon watched him, and approached, to get a closer look, and spoke again, only this time with a more angry tone. "You are me, but how is this possible? There is only one of me. It is my gift." He stopped feeding, as his demonic side felt the rage directed towards him by this colossus. "I bear you no ill. I too wish to know who I am, and who you are. Are we not one of the same? A lesser form, and their greater?" The daemon let out a blast of rage towards him, sending him spinning across the landscape, tossed around like a rag doll, till he steadied his mind and stopped his motion. "No! I am the one, the only. This was my gift from the source, that I would be his champion. You are a falsity." "So why do I bear your power, your mark, your imprint? Why are you I, and I you?" The daemon stopped and moved to surround him, but he moved quickly to keep it at a safe distance, if there were such a thing, and it stopped moving altogether. "You should not be. Let us see what you are. Show me your true name." "It wants my true name?" "How can I tell you what I do not know?" he shouted back to it. "Give me your essence. Let me see what you are. You have seen me, and this is why you are here. Now show me your kind, so I may decide your fate." He reasoned simply that he was not touchable by this daemon, no matter its power, as he was after all on a prime, and within a host body. So he opened up and drew a small part of his essence from within, and let it flow through the air. The daemon looked at this thread, and as he did, took it in his own magic, and started to pull it apart, but in doing so realized something was wrong, very wrong, and shed a portion of its energies, moving back from the drawn thread. "You are the one that was gifted," it uttered. The maelstrom began to slow as he stopped feeding, his attention focused now upon him. "You are the one that has seen the host, has walked with the divine. You are the destroyer." He noticed that it was slowly gathering the power it had been channeling into the realm, back into itself, as though protecting itself. "You are my missing part, the part the source refused to gift to me. We were supposed to be one. We were supposed to be me. You took my power." And with that the skies rained down, the earth shook and upturned, and it all came his way, at once, in one realm-shattering strike. Against another daemon, this would have been very effective. Against him, however, it was a hindrance at best, for the host shell protected him from all mundane forms, as well as the demonic. So he just stood his ground as it bore down on him through the storm of bodies, buildings, trees and stone that rained down upon him. It then began rending at his form, and despite its immense power, it could merely hold him, nothing more, as he stood his ground and bore the brunt of the attacks. This continued for many strikes, until the daemon realized he could not harm him. Not here, at least. Not upon the prime.
I will take what was meant to be mine, but not this day. You cannot take my power, as we are the same. And were you to open your essence to me again, I would rend it from that shell and leave you a husk destroyer.
Why do you call me destroyer? He asked, finally having his attention without claws and spikes flying.
Because of what you did to your own kind. You consumed their identities, their very essences. You removed their gifts from all existence. You tore them apart, unraveled their magic.
Their threads?
Yes! You destroyed their identities, their very essence. They are gone, forever, never to return. And it's all because of you!
I did not know. The daemon part of me. It has a hunger that will not quiet.
We all have that hunger, you fool!
But I have tasted the host.
You have what?
The daemon's voice now trembled, but not with anger or rage. I have killed many of the host, what some call the divine, in the very place where they reside. And you know what? It was easy for me. He let the words sink in. And since that time, I have never found anything to quell that hunger, the voices within me that demand I feed. The host can keep them at bay, but you see, the primes are also able to give me the same satiation, as you have shown me this day in your maelstrom.
The host is mine to destroy. It is what I was created for.
And yet I am better suited, brethren. They stood watching each other intently for a time, each waiting for the next action from the other.
So, I will leave this prime to your whim, destroyer. But when next we meet, I will dethrone your power, on my terms. For without your divinity, your host-crafted shell, you are nothing more than another daemon on which to feast. And now I have seen your threads, I know how to protect myself from you. But tell me, you cannot create, can you? Where are your minions? I choose not to, and the source gifted me accordingly. So my power is absolute. But what is yours?
He smiled. Oh, my power? I have none. None at all. Well, none of my own. I do, however, have all those that I have taken. The daemon looked on and nodded in understanding.
Ah, you are a thief of others. A doppelganger.
He shook his head. Oh no, you don't understand. I have all their powers. And with that, he began to channel forth a minion, their identity taking shape, and becoming one of the fallen host he had taken. The daemon began to back away, realizing that this was actually a creature of divinity. But this was not possible.
How?
He started, but the minion's host turned his hand towards him and pushed forth a dark magic, a demonically charged blast of divinity a chaotic force of unbelievable power, of impossible origins, and it struck home, searing clear through the top few feet of the manifestation, and causing searing pain to the daemon itself.
You have made an enemy of my will this day, Destroyer, and you will feel the sting of my spines, you abomination.
With those words, a rift of energy wrapped itself around the immense bulk of the daemon, and within seconds it vanished, leaving a swath of destruction where it had been. He stood alone upon this prime, amidst the devastation. He had met another of him, or at least near enough to be of him, and it had been a glorious sight. But he had also learned an important fact. It feared his power, and somehow he had perverted the powers of the divine in the blast he had unleashed, and this intrigued him. This should not be so, but as he examined his threads, he noticed something strange. His daemonic part, his true self, had changed, albeit in a small manner. It had been infused with the prime, a large amount of such raw power, and he had never felt it before. The prime was not of demonic origins, but formed of the hosts themselves, with infusion and imparting from other planes of existence. Could it be that in the act of infusing himself with this power, and his unique origins as they were, that he had somehow birthed a new magic, a new power? It was something that equaled the host's own, but with far darker origins, and he would come to realize this power in time, as he flexed his newfound prowess and began to leech more of this prime into his form. He spent many years absorbing this prime, and several times small rifts began to open from other daemons wishing to join in the feast, but as they appeared, he sucked the rifts dry, blocking their access, preventing them from taking what was his. This power would be his and his alone, and it would grant him a reservoir of raw energy with which to make his goals a reality. Once he had drained the entire prime and taken it into himself, the host shell, his very divine essence, cracked and split like some gigantic insect carapace. His true form grew to contain this new level of power, and as it solidified, the power of his divinity settled into its new host. This was how the other daemon had become so large, and as he flexed his new form, he realized it was so much more powerful than before, in both demonic force as his threads grew and multiplied from the magic he had taken as he had sucked the prime dry, and divine power gleaned from the very prime itself as it was broken down and absorbed into his shell. It was then, after this span of time, that he turned his attention back to the prime from which he had traversed, to the place of the scaled ones. He found that he did not need to ask them to open a rift, as his new levels of magic allowed him to effortlessly create a pathway, his threads chasing to his destination and fording a channel through the flows of the planes between. As he arrived in their realm, he did not recognize it at first. It was barren instead of lush, and the mountains were bare and ashen, the sky a dreary tone of grey, and not a tree could be seen where there should be vast forests. Am I in the right place? His thoughts slowed as he tried to make sense of the view, but it was as he allowed his threads to explore that he realized what had happened, and rage began to build within him. His threads had touched a scaled one, or rather what was left of it, torn asunder, ripped apart by magics he had not known until this encounter on the other prime. The daemon who called him brethren had been here, and he had done this. Whether to anger or remove aid, he did not know, nor care, as for the first time he felt loss, true loss. These creatures had been his only friends, if he could call them that. They had treated him with kindness despite his heritage, his form. They had taken him in and nurtured his understanding of the planes, of the realms, had taught him about the primes and histories, and helped him unlock the secrets of some of his power. This brethren would pay, and pay with his very essence. He would strip it, remove every thread from the planes, destroy every vestige of his power, from the very primes themselves. This daemon would know pain, fear, and terror before he was removed from existence. This was his first true anger, his taste of unbound rage, and it fueled his lust for power for millennia to come. He spent the next time, of which was a great span, searching the demonic planes for answers, for the true home of this daemon, but none knew of it. Those who refused to answer became one with his threats, and then he learned their truths, growing as he did. Those who aided him became his envoys, but in time his magics corrupted their threats and turned them to his own side. It seemed as his power grew, his corrupting influence began to seep from his form without great concentration on his part, as though his demonic side was vying for control, for power, for the opportunity to spread like a plague across the threads of magic and reality that it encountered. He began to be known as the Scourge for a time by his own kin, as everything he touched eventually turned, decayed, and became one with him. With this realization, the daemons pulled back from contact with him, as eventually just the mere meeting with him was enough for a thread to become tainted, and if not cut out, would spread throughout their forms, their lands, and their vassals. But in all his travels and all his conquests, he could find no trace of this brethren, nor could he find anyone who could point him in the direction of those that the Scaled Ones had tried to contact on his behalf. And then something unexpected occurred. A message for him, written in the very threads themselves, guiding him to a meeting place. By now his place of origin was a beacon of power within the vastness of the planar landscape, and although they could sense it, and some could even see it, none would dare venture close, as the taint of his threads permeated all who touched, and none would do so willingly. However, those of the Prime knew nothing of this, as they could not see or sense from where they sat. This power grew unknown to their kinds, hidden from the host. He wanted this. In fact, he needed it, in order to return and dethrone them, take their power, and finish what he had begun. But this message puzzled him. It was from within the planes themselves, deeper than he knew or had seen, as though the very essence of magic itself was leading him somewhere. And so he ventured and journeyed deeper into the demonic realms than any of his kind had ventured in aeons. This place was so deep and thick with magic, permeating evil beyond measure, and here, despite his body being of the host, and immensely more powerful than it had been when he first ventured out, he could feel it slowly eroding his form. He had not known this place existed, and he had seen all of existence, all of the planes, all that the host could see. Of course, this was beyond their sight, in the same ways their own plane was beyond the sight and reach of daemonkind. In fact, he doubted they even knew of this place, as he slowly pushed his way through the thick threads that tried to crush and hold him, to prevent his movement onward. Here the threads were so tightly packed that they were like cloth was to stone. Threads moved at his command, or were brushed aside by his touch under normal conditions, and even the deepest planes he had been to had been little more than pushing his way through what would equate to water at most to those of the living kind. But this was like pushing a way through a thick liquid, perhaps somehow walking through sand up to his torso, or swimming through tar. Perhaps other ways to explain it could be found, but his experience of reality had been sparse. But none other than he had been here. At least none from the primes, he would wager. How wrong he was. As he forged further, deeper, the threads became like stone, unmoving, unrelenting in their pressure to prevent his movement, and he paused for a moment to gather his power, to try to force the threads to move to his will. But he noticed something else. His threads could not pierce the threads here. They were unable to coerce them to his will, and try as he might, he could not see the nature of these threads, as they refused to bend to his will, and the deeper he moved, the weaker he found himself becoming, as the host-given shell grew weaker. Then, without warning, the threads parted, and he fell for a great distance, through a space almost devoid of thread, where he could only sense the hint of such circling at distance from him. And he knew he had pushed past this barrier. But into what? Now, that was the question. As he fell, he became aware of a presence, unlike any he had yet felt. He felt the life of the prime rife within this creature, and the depths of daemonhood too, but also the spark of divinity upon its soul. But not how his felt. This was a purity of form and power, shaped and wielded, not worn like his own, and the power was seemingly faint, yet strong at the same time. It confused his senses, and his threads could not find anything to move towards, or grasp hold of to gain purchase and discover more. "You have come. I knew you would," the voice boomed out, yet surrounded him. Neat trick, he thought, as he still wrestled with his power, to try and push out and feel his surroundings. "You cannot do that here, and nor would I wish you to, so please, stop, before you run your strength down to that of a newling." He felt himself slowly being lowered toward a rough platform, a slowly spinning chunk of what felt like prime under his feet, and landed on it almost gently. A good distance from him, on another such chunk of prime, a towering robed figure stood, of great stature. Yet this creature was unknown to him, but seemed to look as though it bore markings from every daemon he had known of, and every host he had ever seen, and more. "You are a mortal creature?" he asked. "Yes, and no. If you mean, am I alive, then yes, and no. And if you mean, I will succumb to age and die of decay in the passage of time, then also yes, and no." He talks and makes no sense, he thought. "Why did you ask me to come here?" "I asked you here to see that you were as had been arranged, and I am both elated and disappointed by what lies before me." "I am a disappointment to you?" He could feel his daemon rage starting to build at these words. "Yes, for you were to be the one, to unite them all, as I had been the first to understand them all. But it seems that chrylsis failed once more, and now you walk the plains, devouring, destroying, and plotting against your kin." It adjusted its stance, and he could see this creature was not just a bipedal creature, a gigantic man-thing, if you will, but it had many arms, each covered in markings unknown to him, as tattoos, scars, perhaps magical patterning, sigils, glyphs perhaps. He did not understand what he was seeing, but as it moved several of its arms, he could see and feel the ebb and flow of many types of magic around it, and knew this was a being of great mastery, and it would seem a degree of such even over his kind. "I have seen the birth of the gods, one and all. of the seeds of the daemonkind spawn and spread forth through the ether like a never-ending plague of magical origins. The source gifts life to your kind, and chrylsis gifts life to the others of what you know now as the divine. And between you and they, the unaligned planes reside, with their own eternal neutrality, forever weaving their blessings and imbuing what they touch with their own uniqueness. And then, upon the places taken from the prime of existence, prime realms are formed, and there your kind pierce the veil, and wage war upon the hosts and their creations, in a never-ending cycle of attrition and death beyond imagining. And yet the prime allows it, despite all your kind's attempts to subvert it to your own ends, for the prime is eternal. It was here before you, and will be here long after your hosts lose their lights, and your essences are drawn into one singular darkness, and fall beyond the scope to reach the prime again. They paused for a moment, and turned their full attention back to him. And then it will begin anew. This creature knew more than he could imagine. But what was it? It was no daemon, no god, no prime creature he had ever seen, and yet somehow it held all three aspects of reality. And then he remembered what the Scaled Ones had told him, of one who had been born the first of all, upon the prime, and turned his hand to the prime and the hosts as well as the source. You are him, aren't you? The last of the ones the Scaled Ones told me of. He felt a warmth come from the creature, and it answered. Yes, I knew the Scaled Ones you saw the demise of well, for I taught them what they needed to know to survive when the lights of the gods were taken from them. He felt a coldness sweep past him, despite being able to actually feel such things. By one born of the source and host. Had they known you had done this, they would never have aided you, never have shown you the ways of their kind, of their magics, and you would never have met the spined one, and you would never have gained an insight into anger, rage, and loss. You owe them more than you realize. He looked on, and tried to fathom how this creature could know these things. But before he could speak, it continued. And now you seek the spine for revenge, the source for payback of some kind you believe you deserve, the hosts for, sport it would seem, and anything that gets between you and your whims, as more power means more knowledge, and more knowledge means more power, and so the cycle will continue until you are all, or you are. It paused, letting the words sink in before finishing with, stopped. It took some time before he acknowledged the words he heard, and controlled his building rage, as he was too weak from the travel to even consider fighting this creature, and he had a feeling that this thing wielded more than he could comprehend. He must learn before he confronted it. Stop me how, may I ask? Simply put, if you do not stop yourself, your own actions will stop your advance, and eventually be your downfall. For as you once rose from the source, as some of your kin do, you also fell from the host, also as some do. And when all is said and done, that which is not part of you will be your undoing. He drew himself up, standing proud in the face of this towering creature, and as he tried to speak, it motioned with many of its hands, and as they moved, they traced visible magic across the air between them. He never knew this was possible, to see the threads in pure form, as something tangible to eyes not of divine or daemon kind. And as he watched, almost mesmerized by these actions, he was hit by a force so hard he reeled and was engulfed by immense pressure from all around, as he was sent speeding through the thickened threads he had traversed. In short time he found himself weakened of demonic power and drained of his divine reserves, but in a place he knew well. The plane he had made his own private battleground, that of his first demonic conquest. His anger could wait, for he needed to regain his strength, and he did so by taking that which he created into himself slowly, bathing in it, and slowly rejuvenating his reserves, all the while thinking on this creature. He knew not its name, its identity, its kind, nor its plane of residence. It had shown it had the power to toss him around like a rag doll, should he confront it within the depths of the demonic. Well, what should he call it? He had nothing to draw from, but decided to call it the place of solid threads for now, until he could discover what the place really was. He also needed to know more of his kind, both origin sides, for this creature was a threat to him, as was the spined one, as he had called it, and he needed to regain his power and make his plans now to include this new factor. Time flowed by, and he gleaned all that he could from his threats as he let them explore the plains where he waged his wars. He learned of other primes, many bursting at the seams with life, magic, and links to the hosts, and for a time he looked to these places for power and possible information on those who would threaten him. He had started to wage wars against many planes at once, using his Dark Host duplicates to do his bidding, with them acting as conduits for his power, and each of them being gifted a spark of his own, so they may also duplicate those lesser creatures that they would slay or take into their fold. This was where the great planar war began, as this was when the primes would once more become aware of his presence, and his now growing power. He sought out a plane that would be a single forward power base to launch his spearhead from, and he took it swiftly. These daemons merely a drop towards his now vast and growing power. He chose this place, as it was close to the prime he was targeting, and also because for some reason, someone had left him an open portal of permanence to use for his assault. He would not give such an opportunity up easily. This prime had a myriad of heroes upon it, as well as their adversaries. He decided not to announce his presence immediately, as he sat and witnessed the sheer power of the host's own believers here, and was taken aback by their competence in wielding their gifts. They could actually prove challenging, he mused, as he slowly looked around. Taking a lesser life, a young child born of magic, he walked the lands where the child had been born. This place was strange, with a mass of sentient life like he had never seen, and a background level of pure magic that was unlike anything he had ever felt since his reckoning with the spine. Yes, he should walk among them before he would wage war here. He tried to manifest his powers to protect this vessel, but discovered that, although his essence could pass into this prime, he could not summon a tether to his host shell, thereby meaning that as he walked here, his true self residing within his host would never know what he knew, unless he returned to it so it could absorb what he had discovered. It was a strange feeling to have left his body, drifting almost lost in this tiny mortal shell of sinew and blood, not knowing what was transpiring where he had left his host. It took a while for him to realize that this must be how those who were slain must feel, no longer having a place to reside, merely floating away from what they knew, no longer having their anchor to their realm. He did not enjoy this feeling. He felt vulnerable. He also discovered that this creature was getting harder to control the longer he spent from the host, and after a week or so of time in this prime, he felt he needed to return to renew the power he felt falling from him, as his threads were not strong enough to control it for too long. As he re-entered his host, the shell he had created went back to the world, devoid of purpose, but in time he would be able to implant purpose to them, giving them a drive to serve and spread his threads. This he had to do if he was to accomplish anything here. Here where the ambient magic was far greater than his own tethers, where he could not manipulate the weave as easily as he normally could. But why? Why could he not do so? His drone shell wandered the world for a month or two, and when it returned, it brought with it the news of many things it had heard. But he needed definitive answers to specific questions. But these duplications could not think for themselves, so he would have to wait. Perhaps wait until he found something that would work for him for payment, perhaps, as this seemed the way of beings of the primes.